In this program, we're going to have several objectives, but I want you to recognize that because we're doing a full year, you're getting a condensed version. So the resources that we provide to you are really important that you hang on to them and read about the different seasons as you go along, just as a reminder. Our objectives today are to understand the importance of soil structure and how to protect it, to understand how to match vegetable groups and varieties to the season. Spring is usually going to be cold to cool, so you're looking for plants that will grow in that kind of environment. Summer, cool to hot. Fall and winter are warm to cold. And we know how cold it can get and how hot it can get. Know your available season extenders to enhance your soil warmth and to speed plant growth. Now, these are something that you're going to be using not just in the spring. You will be using them again in the fall and winter. Learn to restore soil after spring rains and summer harvests. Know where to find information on year-round gardening in our short seasons here in the Willamette Valley. Why would anybody want to garden all year round? Well, there are several reasons here. It's sunnier and more comfortable to be outside and get a little vitamin D. You can also do a lot of warm season crops. They grow well in the warmth, not so well when it's really cool. Fall and winter, there's less weeding, less watering, and usually a little less harvesting. So you can catch up on those things that you stuck in the freezer and now need to get canned. Slugs and snails, however, are still an exception. They don't seem to mind much of the weather. If it's too cold, they'll just snuggle down. And as soon as it's warm, they're out again. Winter is a time where we can still eat what is in season. There's not a lot, but there is some. And fresh picked vegetables are delicious. And it's a good reason to get outside and see what's going on in your winter garden, because before long, you're going to be planting for spring. It's always good if you can get your garden ready early in spring for your early spring plantings. Our topics today, the first section is going to cover things that are basically applicable to every season of the year. The location is not really going to change. Your soil pH and the structure hopefully will not change. The time needed to care for the garden will vary because, quite honestly, it's going to take you less time in the winter. The principles of garden health will be covered. Where to find help for planning year-round gardening, and that will include handouts, a couple of magazines, and there are some applications out there that you can use that will help. Deciding how to get plants, including starting and caring for seeds and small plants, will be covered, and the differences between plant varieties for spring and fall, and how to calibrate a soil thermometer. Season extenders for plant and soil warmth will be covered, and it'll be something that you'll want. Resources for more information will also be covered. And the second half will be actually going into the seasons, what may be different at the different seasons. You'll be able to seed directly in the soil for many things in the summer that you cannot do at early spring. Fall and winter temperatures will go from warm to cold, harvesting matured crops will happen, and you're going to be storing vegetables. We'll at least talk about getting them in the ground and what it means for them to overwinter. Early spring temperatures can go, well, almost anywhere these days. And we'll talk about harvesting some of the plants that have overwintered. So the needs of your vegetable garden do not really change. You're going to look for the sunniest, the warmest spot, preferably south facing. And if you could do it against a wall or a fence that will reflect light and warmth, that's even better. We're looking for anywhere from 6 to 8 hours as a minimum daily amount of sunshine, and more is better. Definitely think about the winter sun and where it's going to be in your garden when you locate your garden for year-round gardening. Place the garden near a water source and on a high spot to avoid drainage and cold air pockets. I skipped over the one here that said pH. Most vegetables are going to grow in a pH of 6.0 to 7.5. If you haven't had a recent soil test that at least tested the pH, you need to get a good test taken. The nutrient levels of other things like your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium might be something you'd want to throw in if you're going to an analytical lab to have your pH done. And the time that it can take to work in a garden and have it be successful year-round is also going to vary a little bit. But for those gardens that get started in the spring, a 10 by 10 will take 40 minutes of cultivation a week. Then as we head into the watering season, it'll take 30 minutes for each watering session. So here's a little bit about soil structure. In this slide, you see some lovely blue ribbony things. That's the water that is allowed to percolate through the soil, through the macropores. Those macropores are air spaces that can be filled with water. Inside those funny little groups, you'll see little blue circles. Those are also water. As water hits into the soil, it will turn into smaller bits of water, which can be retained in these aggregates, which include soil minerals as the sort of brownish looking things, and green for organic matter. So these kind of hang together, and the water helps them hang together even better. They store that water to release over time, while the blue lines are in the macro pores, and those are going to go into the soil and drain. So what are the principles of soil health? Basically, soil contains 25% water, 25% air, 45% minerals, and a small amount, 5% of organic matter. But the organic matter is very important. Try to keep your soil covered. Use a crop, a cover crop, or mulch to control temperature, to minimize evaporation, and to reduce compaction from rain. We don't think a lot about rain compacting the soil. However, if you have ever looked at a building that had no gutters on it and seen a line, a divot line, in the soil, it usually goes down a ½ inch to an inch. That is where the rain has compacted the soil. Protect the soil from compaction also by designating traffic areas. This is easy to do if you have raised beds, and even if you do mounded raised beds, because between those, you're still going to need a traffic area. And that just keeps the traffic in one area so that you don't have to tread in the garden beds themselves. Minimize soil disturbance. Reduce or eliminate tilling. Do as little digging as you possibly can, and eliminate or minimize any pesticide use. For annual plants, you can cut them just below the soil level and leave the roots to compost their nutrients back into the soil. Just leave them. Never work wet soil. It also will cause compaction if you're out there working when it's wet. Grow a variety of plants for living roots over a long season. And in this case, it's going to carry a season to season, so it should work out pretty well. And that will help provide the food for microbes. And if you intermix your crops and use crop rotation, that will also help your soil. Amend the soil in fall with about a 1/2 inch of compost. This will increase your organic matter. And again, you can grow cover crops to protect the soil surface, and then later turn them into the soil as an amendment. Organic fertilizers need time and warm soil for the microbes to break down for plant use. Now you can use chemical fertilizers, and those are already mixed in water, and those can be taken up much more quickly by the plants. You have some organic fertilizers like fish fertilizer that can also be worked into a water emulsion and easier for plants to take up. The hand squeeze test will allow you to see whether your soil is workable or not. Don't wait for the mud to crawl up the back of your shoes. Do this one first and you'll know whether you should even be out in the garden. Take a handful of soil and squeeze it really tightly. If any water drips out, just stop. You need to go back and look at the seed catalogs and do your planning for your full year of gardening. If the soil crumbles and doesn't drip, it's probably okay. The other thing that it can show you by doing this test is that if it does a reverse mold of your palm, and it doesn't fall apart even if you push it, it probably means your soil has a little bit more clay in it than the best soils might have. But remember, the good thing about clay is that it also carries the nutrients that our plants need. So in this process, you need to decide whether you're going to start with seeds, plant some of those seeds inside so you can grow them into seedlings to plant outside, roots, tubers, or bulbs. You need to decide what you're going to do. Now, in the process of deciding what you're going to do, you may also find that you're going to use more than one of these methods. There are things that can be planted out in early spring and spring, while you need to plant some things that won't be planted out until summer. You need to get them started inside unless you're planning to purchase them. Things you can seed are going to be carrots and peas and lettuce and beets and radishes. Plants would be cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, celery, lettuce, and kale. Those need a little bit of a boost to get started in the spring. Tubers and bulbs will include things like potatoes, onion, and garlic. Some people will plant their garlic in early spring. It's actually better if you can plant it in the fall, because that way it will follow the normal rain cycle and you won't have to be down there watering all the time. Okay, planting dates, lists, and information that you might find very helpful. Several of these are OSU publications. Others are regional seed catalogs, which sometimes contain a great deal of good information. And then there are gardening books. The Growing Your Own that's shown here also has some good information in charts, and that would be on page 7. The Fall and Winter Gardening one contains charts on 3 and 5, and all of those will be very helpful to you, letting you know when you can plant, when you could expect it to germinate if you started from seeds, and you'll need that. Here's the chart. We'll show it again later when we're actually talking more about plants. This breaks it down into 4 regions in the state of Oregon, and it gives you soil temperatures that you need, which is why we're showing things like the thermometers for the soil. Directly sowing seeds, you still have to wait for the soil to warm at least to 35 to 40 degrees. Doesn't seem very warm to me, but there are some seeds out there that can be directly sown because the temperature is just right for them to germinate. And typically the air temperature is a little bit warmer than the soil temperature at this time of year, and they love it. When you've got really large seeds to plant outside, you don't have to soak them, but research shows when you soak them, it does help in speeding the germination and sprouting process. Cover the seeds once they have been soaked. You can cover the seeds to a specified depth, and you can find that either on the annual production map or chart and some of the other ones that are out there. If you've got a seed packet, it may also tell you how deep you need to plant them. And water as needed to keep these seeds wet or moist. The thing with that is if they dry out at all, those little hair roots will also dry out. If you don't pre-germinate, you'll be waiting for the seeds to germinate and sprout. Don't do like I have, which said, oh gosh, those peas have been in the ground for at least 10 days. Why don't I have anything up yet? And I have to look. When you look, you destroy the hair roots, and then you're starting all over again. Check every few days just to make sure that they're still moist and that they don't need any more water. Now, the picture here basically shows 4 seeds up towards the top that are rather shriveled looking, and 4 seeds at the bottom that have been soaked. And you can soak 2 to 4 hours. If you forget, 24 hours is usually the maximum. Sometimes you're going to be starting seeds indoors. So what do you need for that? Well, of course, you're going to need seeds. If you're only growing one thing, you can skip the labels. However, many of us, and particularly since you're talking about gardening all year round, you will probably need to make sure you've got labels so you'll know which plants are which. You're going to need 6-pack cells for the most part. If they're large seeds, you may want to have 3 or 4 inch pots. You're going to moisten the bagged soilless seedling mix. The soilless there is important. This soil has no nutrients in it. It's very good for the seedlings because the seedlings' roots can work through this seedling mix and get a hold very quickly. You're going to use a dome lid or a plastic bag to put these little 6-packs into so that you can keep them moist. A trowel or scoop is usually needed. I just use my hands. And some water-soluble fertilizer. You might not need it right this instant, but as you go along, you will, because that is going to be the nutrients that are there for the plants that you're growing indoors. A heat mat with a thermostatic control is very important if you're starting these like tomatoes or pepper seeds indoors, and a good grow light. Seedling care is another thing. And this is the setup that I have rigged for my house. After the 6-pack cells are filled or the tray with mix is firmed down, plant your seeds. Cover with at least 1/4 inch of moist seedling mix. Get your labels in or on. You may use pasted labels. And you're going to water them in with a dilute fertilizer. A spray bottle can help as well. And you'll be using the spray bottle to water them as they start germinating and need water. You're going to cover these now with, again, either a plastic bag or a clear dome lid. You're going to remove that dome at the emergence of, as the seeds are sprouting. And it won't take very long. The cotyledons and then the first and second leaves come up pretty quickly. And once they're at their second true leaf, now the first leaves are going to be cotyledons and they look very generic. You can tell that they're leaves, but they're very generic. They have no indents, no nothing. So your second true leaf is going to look a lot more like your mature plant. And at that point, you're going to pot them into 3-inch pots or 3 to 4-inch pots. And that's once that they have reached the sides, the roots have reached the sides of the small pot. And then again, when they have reached, you've got them in the 3-inch pot now, and they're growing. And when those roots reach the edge of that 3-inch pot, you're going to either plant them in the ground or plant them to a big pot. You do not want them to become root bound. To remove the pot, soak it in a bucket of water. If you're using seedling mix, you will have to drown them. You will have to hold them down because that's how light a soil mix that is. You're going to soak them in a dilute fertilizer. And when we talk diluted, mine is like 1/12 of what the full 1 month supply for your plants would be. I try to make it about what I figure I'm going to be watering. And if I'm going to be watering every other day, I could water quite a bit during 1 month. So when the bubbles stop, you can invert while holding the soil and do a tap and remove the pot. So there is a difference between spring varieties of plants and vegetables and fall varieties. You would be looking at broccoli that was an early Pac-Man or an early Emerald or an Arcadia. Basically, what that's going to mean is it will handle the cooler temperatures, and those temperatures being air temperature and soil temperature. When you start with your fall ones, which are typically going to be planted in July or started from seed outside in July, you would want to do a purple sprouting, or they can withstand the heat or growing, and they'll grow quite well. But they won't bolt. Some of these that are good for the early spring, the same variety is not going to be good for planting in July. It's too hot and they will just bolt and do their little thing. Kale, spring, whatever your favorite variety is for spring. And then in fall, which is again, it's going to be about midsummer, July or August, you'll want to go to winter red, winter boar, or Siberian. And I think the names probably give you a hint. They can stand a little colder weather. Winter carrots are going to be Danvers, which are half longs. Probably still very tasty. Some tips: curly leaf vegetables can tolerate the cold better. They create an air layer around them that's a little bit warmer. And that's why wind is so hard on little plants, particularly during the winter and the heat of summer. It just dries them out. Let's see. And dark colored vegetables. We already know dark colored clothing attracts heat and warms. It does the same in coloration for plants. Do consider plant spacing as well. Follow the seed packets for the proper spacing for seeds and plants to grow. Now, these guys, known as zucchinis, tend to grow pretty well. This is one hill. I believe it only had 2 plants, and it quickly filled an 8x8 bed with all of its leaves. It was feeling very healthy. My mistake is always to take the square of my raised bed and plant things at the far corners. I've got to go back to really thinking about what is going to be there. So these are soil thermometers. The one on your left that's red, you'll notice, is right about 32 degrees. It's sitting in a glass of ice and ice water. And we know ice is 32 degrees. On the blue one, it says, oh, it's a whole lot warmer. So between 40 and 60, I'm going to say it's shooting at 48. Look at the blue one on the right of your screen. It's been calibrated. On the bottom of the temperature gauge there is a hexagonal nut. These little holders have a place that you can put over that nut and over the the temperature probe and adjust the temperature to what it should be, which is 32 degrees in the ice water. This slide is the introductory for season extenders. And I like to use it because it shows raised beds right off. And raised beds can do a job at helping to warm the soil and keep the soil drier. The uprights in there are for growing vines, melons, squash, and that way you can make better utilization of your space. And you see a lot of milk jugs in there. Well, those are cluches, and the little inset there is basically showing one way to cut out the bottom and put a stick in so it doesn't float away. So the other thing you can do is just slice the bottom with a cross on it, pull those little tabs out and use those to basically secure the jug so it doesn't get blown away. Glass cluches over on the left are beautiful. They are glass, they do break, and you still have to get a vent to them somehow to let hot air out of them so they don't roast your plants. Here are single plant greenhouses and various tunnels. The one up here that has plants planted through plastic with a row cover top on it, that one is warming the soil as well as the air and should help with germination and early growth. This is another tunnel variety, and if you look closely at the larger picture, you'll see there are wires attached as hoops, and that's basically what is holding up the plastic in the inset hoop house. Okay. These are some of the resources that are out there. Seamastergardeners.org is the site. You'll see this again later. These are some of the OSU items that were used. A lot of the ones that say PNW are ones that were worked up together with Washington State. Okay. So this presentation is going to start with summer, and it's going to cover what is going on in the summer. We're almost at summer. Hard to believe, but we only have a couple more weeks of spring. So we're in that change period. The weather seems to think it's closer to winter. So looking forward to next year, when you have already gotten into the mode of year-round gardening, you will probably be able to start an early spring garden, which means those are plants that can handle cooler temperatures to germinate and cooler temperatures to grow in. And you would or could be very much harvesting spring-grown vegetables now. So this is where the program is going to start. Early spring and spring will be covered at the end. So from here, we're going to take the cycle of seasons as we normally think of them. We're just starting in a different spot. If you really want some early things, some of the perennials are wonderful because they come back year after year and they're ready to go pretty early. Asparagus starts putting up spears in March and April. Here we've been enjoying them for over a month and still picking good size harvests. And depending on what varieties you've got in your bed of asparagus, you could be harvesting until and partly into July. Those later months, though, you will have a little more difficulty. In our garden, ours are from seedlings, and so we have quite a variety, and that does allow us to pick for a longer period of time. If you want all male roots, because the males are the ones that are going to invest their energy in spears, please go with roots. You'll be much better off in the end. Excuse me. So the females end up using their energy to make seeds. But this is also the time to get asparagus in the ground. Rhubarb is another perennial, and it can be harvested this month. We've got some really nice stalks out there. Harvest only young, tender stems, because if they get mature, it's like eating wood. Rhubarb roots also do best planted in the spring, and then they have to grow for 2 or 3 years, just like asparagus, without any harvest. So here shows asparagus, and the one on the right is not a zucchini, it is rhubarb. A couple more perennials are Jerusalem artichoke. It's a tuber like potatoes and does grow in the ground like potatoes, but it does not have that rounded, smooth texture on the outside of it. It's harvestable in summer. It does well in zones 3 through 8, and it can stay in the ground for the winter. You can propagate it in the spring by taking some of the tubers that you may have taken that were stored over winter, digging them up, cutting them into tubers, making sure everybody has an eye, and then those can establish fairly quickly in the garden. Now, the other thing you need to know about Jerusalem artichoke is they tend to get a little bit carried away with their own importance, and it can be difficult to get rid of them if you should want to. Otherwise, you end up cooking them for things very much like you would potatoes. The globe artichoke, excuse me, we're still in allergy season. So the globe artichokes can be harvested twice a year. You can get 2 crops. If you cut down your first one, a second one will come up and be available for eating in the fall. To harvest, you're going to leave a 3 to 4 inch stem, and that's for handling, because these are a thistle. They're very pokey. And you want to harvest them before they flower. They too have to be eaten when tender. And these are the Jerusalem artichokes and the globe artichoke. You may have some biennials that were left in the garden or purposefully left and protected over the winter. So these overwintered. The one on the left is Russian red kale. I just never got around to cutting it down. It has long sticks. It's probably sitting up about 2 feet. And we have already plucked some of the tender spring foliage off and consumed it. Parsley with protection can also overwinter, but if it gets very, very cold and you don't have protection for it, it will not overwinter. Biennials are things that will grow in one season over winter, which means they don't get frozen. Now, it doesn't mean these can't get frozen if we have really dramatic, tough weather. And the next season, they're going to seed. So these that I'm showing you are already showing flower buds. Eat them quickly. So harvest begins in summer. These are things that will be ready and are ready, many of them, for harvesting. You'll see some lettuce down there. Well, it's definitely time to harvest lettuce. You can get that in as early as February, depending on the weather and depending on what your soil thermometer says. So potatoes, they're going to be fine going in the ground at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabbage, yeah, 40 is okay for it. Lettuce, 35 degrees. My lettuce starts I had the cold weather earlier in May. They froze. The whole 6-pack was solid. I didn't touch the leaves for fear I would break them off. I brought them inside, gave them a little bit of water. They defrosted, and we've eaten quite a few of those already. But it was interesting to see them freeze completely and then come back. So yeah, cold temperatures, they can handle those. Onions, 35 degrees. Carrots, again, are 40 degrees. So carrots, you have to wait a little bit longer, but there's still a good selection here. And here I have harvest garlic. Well, you will harvest garlic during the summer. What you will harvest first, though, will be the garlic scapes. You see those funny snaky looking things? So you can harvest those, cut them up, saute them, or you can put them in a stir fry or steam them. It really doesn't matter, but they're good to eat and they do taste very garlicky. And it's one of those things that garlic lovers will go for this. So the garlic that's in the bed there, quite frankly, is going to be harvested in July, and the tops will have died down. You can see from this photo, there's a little bit of yellow showing up already. Until your garden cycle is established, this is kind of catching up because we didn't start our gardens quite early enough. We may not have anything right now to harvest, but if you don't, check out the farmers markets. And if you didn't get anything in the ground and you're already at this time of year, look for little vegetable seedlings or plants for the summer garden. Shown here is spinach, a Tuscan kale, and some of those poor little lettuces that got frozen. So what can I grow in this summer? Well, there are a lot of things. You've got root vegetables, beets, carrots, kohlrabi, chives, leek, onion, and radish. And here we have an assortment. We have the kohlrabi, we have onions, and we have leeks growing. The cole family is another one that you can grow in summer. You have to look for non-bolting varieties. Bolting means they get in the ground and the only thing they can think about is flowering. The ones that are shown here need a minimum of 40 degrees temperature for the soil in order to germinate. The air is about 3 to 5 degrees warmer, but there are varieties of these that can be planted in July, August, and take you into fall. So what other summer crops can we be thinking about planting? Well, here we have some warm season crops like tomatoes, beans, peppers, corn, and more. Now, corn you can start out in the soil directly, but you have to wait for the soil to warm up. Tomatoes and beans, you can actually start inside and plant them out as little plants or seedlings. You're going to be able to plant May, early June, and depending on the weather, you'll probably have to use season extenders for protection. Tomatoes are one of those things that while we love them so, they really will need protection probably until about mid-June. You may only have it up a couple of months or a couple of weeks. But in the interim, while you've got a couple of weeks out there to have those on, and they are a hassle to put up, the alternative is to have plants that are frozen. And with your peppers, if they get too cold, the soil's too cold for them, they will just stop growing. Doesn't mean they always will, but that's a real likely outcome. Crops to start from seed. I've never tried it with corn, but here we're starting from seed with the corn and with beans. We tend to start all of those so we have a small plant to put in the ground. For transplants, definitely it's going to be your tomatoes, your peppers. And for either, you can use or plant zucchinis and cucumbers. These are some summer planting examples. We have about 3 slides, and I'll probably go through them pretty quickly. For seeds, you can plant, and we already said beets, I think, carrots, kale. So there are all of those you can plant directly. And ones that you really need to put in as transplants are Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower. Mid-August, okay, mid-August, these are ones that have a short maturity date. In other words, you can harvest them in about 60 days. We've got collards, early carrots, leeks, perennial herbs, chard, and turnips. And some of those, like the early cabbages, you can plant little plants. Kohlrabi would be small plants, and the winter cauliflower would also be small plants. Some more seeds here. I think we've covered some of these, but it's your radish, your lettuces, your bunching onions. And for transplants, broccoli and leaf lettuce. Leaf lettuce is really pretty easy, grows well. And then the exception to some of these is the garlic and the fava beans, which get planted in October, November. So to have summer planting success, start your seedlings indoors or in a greenhouse, the ones that can't handle having any cold without having protection. When you go to plant them out, when you dig the hole that you're going to put the plant into, fill it with water or flood it with water, depending on how you want to say it. Let that drain through. This will hydrate the soil. You've already hydrated the plant, so it's a good thing to give it a chance to get started, to have the soil around it also hydrated. Use a shade cloth for high heat, and you may want to water them from overhead, which is something we usually discourage completely, and mist them. Those are things that can help cool your seedlings or your young plants in the garden. Of course, watering these good before we come to a really nasty hot spell is also an excellent idea. In the summer, remember to save space for succession planting, because fall is going to be coming. After harvest, use that space to plant fall vegetable crops, and that's usually going to be in the midsummer. Learn the crop family names, cole, leafy greens, roots, for your fall crop rotation, because between summer and fall is an excellent time to rotate the crop. And don't forget to fertilize. You've already grown plants for a couple of months here, and at this point, some of the nutrients in the soil have already been used by your first plantings. For succession planting and for year-round, when you've got leafy greens, you're going to want to take things like your spinach and your lettuce and your kale and plant them every couple of weeks. And fertilizing for foliage, you would be using a nitrogen fertilizer. Any that has a higher nitrogen amount than the other two, you'll be doing fine. A balanced fertilizer where they're all the same level. If you can't find one that just has the nitrogen in it, that will work too. Be a little light on the fertilizer, perhaps. Do not use a balanced fertilizer on your tomato plants because they love to grow leaves. But as they're growing leaves, they are not producing any fruit, which is what you planted them for. For fruit, tomatoes are a heavy phosphorus feeder, and they really do need a little bit more to promote flowering and fruiting. Many of them around here, depending on what your soil nutrients come out to be, may not need the extra, but it will help them. Fertilizing for roots, that's potassium. And it basically feeds root things like onions, carrots, garlic, and there they are. So probably your radishes would use it too, but always check. Plan and plant a fall, winter garden now. So we're in July. We're still planting seeds for summer because some of the crops that we're planting are only going to be about 60 days before maturity, which is pretty good. That would be June and July. So in this case, we're going to be planting and harvesting right about the same time. So you don't really get to catch your breath with year-round gardening. Make sure you're using vegetables that are for fall and winter or cool season crops. Decide which crops you want to grow. Of course, that's very important and typically is going to be what you're growing. Find out the planting dates. Most will be around July, midsummer for seeds, and you can plant seeds. You just have to keep them moist. Look for suitable varieties. That's the ones that won't bolt in the heat and can take temperatures a little bit lower later on. And plan your season extenders. You won't necessarily put them on now, but if they're planned, they'll be there ready to go. So this is the garden late summer and fall. Mostly harvesting, eating, and canning if you're a person who cans. Your summer harvest will be your garlics and your summer vegetables. So you'll have several things that you're harvesting. Early fall harvest would be before the frost or rain. So in other words, you've got a whole bunch of green tomatoes out there on your tomato plants and a bunch of bush beans and a few peppers. And then they say it's going to get down to 30 something. Well, we already know that peppers and tomatoes who are related like to have really warm temperatures. You're going to harvest fall through winter, things like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. These are the ones that you started in midsummer. And some of these you will harvest in early spring. One year I thought, oh, I'll just go ahead and plant some little seedlings in the fall. And I think it was October. It's a little late for doing that. I did give them a clutch tunnel so that they had more warmth and a little less rain. And I harvested them in early spring. So fall and winter crops, there's really two types of crops for fall. One is quick growing. So you can do peas, radishes, greens, and spinach. These are things that you're anticipating harvesting fairly early in the fall. And then there are the things that are the overwintering, and that's going to be a lot of your root vegetables, your cole crops, your bunching onions, your fava beans, and garlic. So here's the garlic. And what are we going to do about covering the soil? The garlic here is planted typically in October. So you're going to be planting. These guys will have been gone by about July, and now you're into planting your garlic in October through early December. And that will be harvested then the following July. Okay. As part of your fall cleanup, you might want to get a mulch down. And if you don't want to do a mulch, you can continue growing crops there. Cover crops, it would be more typical for the fall and winter. But this is nice and clean, and it'll get your garden ready for spring. Here's some things that you can leave in the garden for storage. The leeks on the left will do fine. You'll be basically taking something as a mulch, probably leaves, and putting those around them. Fortunately for us, the leaves arrive just in time for us to use them out in a garden that we're planning to overwinter. On the right are carrots. Again, you want to have leaves that will cover those, or you'll have frozen carrots, at least partially. And then in the center there is the rainbow Swiss chard. Now, my husband grew this chard in Anchorage, and it was very interesting. He didn't have to do anything to it. In Anchorage, once it was frozen till spring. All he did was go out and break off a few stalks. So here's some minimum pictures because now we're shifting into away from winter into our early season and spring vegetable garden. So this one basically has, I think it has peas over on the far side. They rotate their vegetable garden vegetables very well. And so these may not all have been taken in the same year, but I did see another one on this one. And the cabbage is a very noticeable thing. You see the little tiny funny looking things sticking up, kind of like grass. Okay, those are going to be a lot of your onions getting started. Potatoes up here a little closer. No tomatoes and no corn yet. Too early. Okay, the health principles I'm just repeating here. Keep your soil covered, decide what you're going to do that, protect the soil structure with designated traffic areas. And I think you noticed that there were rows there in that garden. Minimize the soil disturbance, never work it wet, grow a variety of plants, use crop rotation, and give a little longer if you're going to use organic fertilizers. And here's that same test to see if your soil is too wet. This spring has been very wet, and that makes it a little harder for us to get out and get things in. When you plant for early crops, make sure they're also early maturing. There are some that will need 60 to 90 days. Well, that's 3 months. So your 60-day ones are ones that will come on and be available earlier. This is a repeat of the publications, and you will get this in your list of resources. This chart I find really good. It's a little hard to read in a miniature form, but once you get it up to size, it's got 4 regions here in Oregon, and it covers them pretty well. It gives you the minimum, optimum, and maximum soil temperature and air temperature, when to plant for your region, chock full of information. Again, you're going to decide at each season, are you going to use seeds that you can plant into the ground? Are you going to use plants and wait until you've got the little seedlings? So if it's seeds, again, carrots, peas are a really good one. The carrots, the lettuce is really good because you've got a very early date on it. Tomatoes, peppers, they're later. So decide what combination you're going to be using. Use the season extenders. I'm going to go back just a second. This one shows black plastic in the garden. That black plastic in the garden is going to warm the soil, prevent weeds from coming up, and it will help keep the soil underneath it drier so you can get an earlier start to your spring planting. Seed starting indoors, same thing. This time of year, you probably do not have to have a heat mat. That's only if you want to add one. Typically, your indoor temperatures will be fine. You will still need the grow light. Otherwise, they will grow long, skinny, and towards the light. Again, you're going to soak your large seeds. You're going to focus on some of the cold crops because they actually are cool season. Cool season leafy plants are here. Now, we don't always think of things like the peas and the dwarf gray sugar peas as being leafy, but the foliage on them is edible and apparently pretty good. So there are cultures out there that do utilize them. Your root crops can be used early. And here we've come to the end. And this is a year in the life of a garden. Early spring, you saw those in a larger format where you could sort of see them and what they were. Here's the spring format where you can see the potatoes on the left. You can see the cabbage. You can see the lettuce that's already been harvested. I think some of the cabbages may have been harvested too. You've got onions, and over on the far right, you've got carrots. Summer growth is just, here we are. They're not quite ready for this to be harvested, most of it, but it will be shortly. And then you have your summer and fall planting and the harvesting time. With that, we'll be taking questions now. We won't have a whole lot of time, but we will have some time. Okay, there we are.
Thank you for such a lovely presentation. You know, you did such a thorough job that there were very few questions, so you answered a lot of them. There was just a couple of questions to be answered. And one of them, we kind of discussed this before we began. Some of the questions that came in are from people who don't live in our Willamette Valley. And instead they live in the Klamath region, or they live in Central Oregon. And what do you think our best advice for them is?
Well, the best advice for them is, number one, you can go ahead and look at the charts and things that have been made up, but contact your local extension agent, because they will be able, if nothing else, to help you through and make sure that changes for your specific area can be addressed. Some of us live with a lot of rain. Some of us live with hardly any. So that's probably my best advice on that one.
Okay, and do you have any tips for how to keep cold season crops for winter and spring harvest from bolting during the late summer?
In late summer, when you start planting these things, whether you're buying a plant or it's a seed, check that seed packet. There are varieties that do not bolt quickly, and that's what you're going to need.
Perfect. The last question is, did you recommend any heirloom varieties of broccoli? This individual wants an heirloom variety.
Well, I have to confess, I have tried broccoli many times and not been, what shall I say, very successful. So I don't know heirlooms, but if you are buying plants or seeds, it will say on the packet. If you do not find it on the packet of seeds, look it up online, and you should be able to find some good information there. Some of them are seed companies that have information out there, and those are wonderful because you don't have to buy the seeds. You may have the seeds that you've already purchased, but they can give you some more detailed information on that particular variety that you're trying to grow.
Okay, great answer. And that's our last question. Thanks so much for a great. Did you have another?
I would just remind people that do garden outside the Willamette Valley that their environment is something that really has to be considered. And here in Oregon, we seem to have a lot of microclimates, and that's part of the reason for contacting your local agent, because they can help you with that. Yeah, they can help make it specific to your location. So the environment includes the weather, it includes your elevation. And I've had a person before who was actually a horticulturist, and she took one of my tomato growing classes. And it wasn't that she didn't know all of this. She knew it. It's just she needed a reminder. And she hadn't thought that she had just moved from about 300 to 400 foot elevation to 1,500 feet elevation. Elevation makes a big difference. So she went through, she used season extenders, everything, every one of them that she could, and then shared it with all her neighbors because her tomatoes were so successful. So you've got to think of all those things, which is what your extension agent can help you with.
Good. Thanks so much for a great presentation.
All righty, you're very welcome. I hope everybody learned at least one or two things.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.